in March 1810. What follows is an extract from a letter written by Mr. Fortin to his master and friend, Monsieur Cadet de Gassicourt. Madame, the Duchess de Montebello, when passing through Strasbourg in the suite of the Empress Marie-Louise, wished to see once more the husband that she had so loved. Thanks to your cares and those of Monsieur de Larry, writes Mr. Fortin, the embalmment of the Marshal has succeeded perfectly. When I withdrew the body from that cask, I found it in a state of perfect preservation. In a lower room of the city hall, I arranged a netting on which I dried it by means of a stove, the heat of which was regulated. I had a very beautiful coffin made of hard wood, well smeared with wax. And now the Marshal, surrounded with bandages and the face exposed, is deposited in his open coffin near that of General Saint-Hilaire, in an underground room of which I have the key. A sentinel is on duty there by day and night. Monsieur Vangen de Geroldsek, mayor of Strasbourg, has given me every facility demanded by my functions. Everything was in this condition when, an hour after the arrival of Her Majesty the Empress, Madame the Duchess de Montebello, who accompanies her as a lady of honor, sent her cousin, Monsieur Coutu, to whose house she had gone to pay a visit to find me. I obeyed her summons. Madame la Marechale asked several questions and complimented me on the honorable mission entrusted to me, and then expressed trembling her desire to see for the last time the body of her husband. For several moments I hesitated to reply, and foreseeing the effect which that sad spectacle would produce upon her, I finally said that the orders I had received were contrary to what she wished. But she insisted in so pressing a manner that I at last yielded to her entreaties. We agreed, as much to avoid compromising me as to prevent her from being recognized, that I would go for her at midnight, and that she should be accompanied by one of her relatives. I went to her house at the hour appointed. As soon as she saw me, she rose and said she was ready to follow me. I permitted myself to detain her for a moment, entreating her to consult her own strength. I warned her of the state in which she would find the Marshal, and begged her to reflect on the impression she would receive from the gloomy place she was about to visit. She answered that she was well prepared, and that she felt all the courage necessary, and that she hoped to receive in this last visit some alleviation of the bitter regrets that she experienced. In speaking thus, her beautiful and melancholy face was calm and thoughtful. We started. Monsieur Coutu gave his arm to his cousin. The carriage of the Duchess followed at a distance, and empty. Two domestics walked behind us. The city was illuminated. The worthy inhabitants were in holiday attire. In many houses, joyous music was exciting them to celebrate this memorable day. What a contrast between these outbursts of frank mirth and our position. At times, I saw the Duchess slacken her pace, shudder, and sigh. My own heart was heavy and my mind confused. At last, we reached the town hall. Madame de Montebello directed her servants to wait for her. She went shortly down to the underground room with her cousin and me. The lantern shed a little glimmer of light. The Duchess trembled and affected a sort of assurance, but when she entered a sort of cellar, the death-like silence which reigned beneath this subterranean vault, the lugubrious light which illuminated it, the aspect of the corpse extended in his coffin, produced a frightful effect upon the Marechal. She uttered a doleful cry and fainted. I had foreseen this accident. My whole attention was fixed upon her, and as soon as I perceived her weakness, I supported her in my arms and made her sit down. I had provided myself with everything necessary to assist her. I gave her the attentions demanded by her position. After a few moments, she regained consciousness. We advised her to withdraw. She refused, rose, and approached the coffin and walked round it in silence. Then, pausing and letting fall her clasped hands, she remained for some time motionless, gazing at the inanimate countenance of her husband, and, watering it with her tears, she came out of this state by saying, in a voice stifled by sobs, "My God, oh my God, how changed he is! I signified to Mr. Cretu that it was time for us to go, but we could only get the Duchess away by promising to bring her back the next day. A promise which was not to be performed. I promptly closed the door. I offered my arm to Madame la Marechale. She willingly accepted it, and when we had left the city hall, I took leave of her, but she required me to enter her carriage and gave orders to have me taken home first. During this short passage, she shed a torrent of tears, and when the carriage stopped, she said to me with inexpressible kindness, "I shall never forget, sir, the important service you have just rendered me." A long time afterwards, the Emperor and the Empress Marie-Louise were visiting together the porcelain manufactory of Sèvres. The Duchess of Montebello accompanied the Empress in the capacity of her Lady of Honor. The Emperor, perceiving a beautiful bust of the Marshal in unglazed porcelain, rarely executed, stopped, and without noticing the pallor which overspread the face of the Duchess, asked her how she liked the bust, and whether she thought it a good resemblance. The widow felt her wound reopened. She could not answer and turned away in tears. It was several days before she reappeared at court. Aside from the unexpected question, which had renewed her griefs, the inconceivable thoughtlessness manifested by the Emperor in putting it had wounded her so profoundly that her friends had all the trouble in the world to induce her to resume her attendance on the Empress. Chapter 7. The Battle of Essling was disastrous in every way. 12,000 Frenchmen were killed. The cause of all this evil came from the breaking of the bridges, which might have been foreseen. It appears to me, for the same thing had happened 2 or 3 days before the battle. The soldiers complained openly. Several corps of the infantry shouted to the generals to get off their horses and fight in the midst of them. But this bad humor detracted nothing from their courage and their patience. One saw regiments remain 5 hours, weapons in hand, exposed to the most terrible fire. 3 times during the evening, the Emperor sent to ask Marshal Massena if he could hold out. And the brave captain, who saw his son fighting for the first time and his friends and most intrepid officers falling by the dozen around him, held out until nightfall. "I will not turn back while daylight lasts," said he. "Those rapscallions of Austrians would be too conceited." The Marshal constancy saved the day. But then, as he said to himself the next day, he was always lucky. At the opening of the battle, he noticed that one of his stirrups was too long. He called a soldier to shorten it, and during this operation, he put his leg over the neck of his horse. A ball came which carried off the soldier and cut a stirrup without touching either the Marshal or his horse. "Well," said he, "it seems I must get down and change my saddle." And the Marshal made this remark crossly. The surgeons and health officers conducted themselves admirably on this terrible day. They displayed unheard of courage and activity which astonished even the Emperor. Hence, in passing near them, he several times addressed them as "my brave surgeons." Monsieur Larry especially was sublime after having treated all the wounded of the guard who were huddled together in the Isle of Lobau. He asked if there was any soup to give them. "No," replied the aides. "Make some of them," said he, pointing to some horses near him. "Make some with the horses that belong to this picket." The horses were the property of a general. When someone went near them to obey Monsieur Larry's orders, the owner exclaimed, grew angry, and swore that he would not allow them to be taken. "Oh, well," said the worthy surgeon, "let them take mine and kill them, so that my comrades may have some soup." So said, so done, and as there were no iron pots on the island, the soup was made in cuirasses. It was black with gunpowder, and there was no salt. Marshal Massena tasted the soup and found it good. One knew not which to admire the most, the zeal of the surgeons, the courage with which they braved danger by caring for the wounded on the field of battle, even in the midst of balls, or the stoical firmness of the soldiers who, lying on the ground, one without an arm, another without a leg, chatted together about their campaigns while awaiting their turn to be operated on. Some of them went so far as to perform acts of politeness. Mr. Doctor, begin with my neighbor. He is suffering more than I am. I can wait a while. A cannoneer had both his legs carried off by a ball. Two of his comrades picked him up and made a litter with the branches of trees on which they laid him to transport him to the island. The poor mutilated fellow did not make a single outcry. I am very thirsty, he said now and then to his porters. As they were crossing one of the bridges, he supplicated them to stop and get him a little wine or brandy to revive his strength. They believed him and departed, but they had not gone 20 steps when the cannoneer cried out, "Don't go so fast, my comrades. I shall arrive sooner than you. Long live France!" And making an effort, he let himself roll into the Danube. The conduct of a surgeon major of the guard some time afterwards came very near compromising the entire corps of His Majesty's esteem. This surgeon, Monsieur M., lodged with General Dorsen and several superior officers in a very delightful pleasure house belonging to Madame the Princess of Liechtenstein. The concierge, an old German, rough and capricious, was very reluctant to serve them and played them all the ill turns he could. It was in vain, for example, that they asked for linen for the beds or the table. He pretended not to understand them. General Dorsen wrote to the princess to complain. She doubtless gave her orders in consequence, but the general's letter remained unanswered. Several days passed. The napkins had not been changed for a month when the general took the notion of giving a grand supper. The wines of Hungary and the Rhine were gulped down. Punch followed. The host was greatly complimented, but with these compliments were mingled some energetic complaints of the doubtful whiteness of the tablecloth and napkins. General Dorset alleged in excuse the ill humor and sordid economy of the concierge, well supported by the deficient courtesy of the princess. "That must not be endured," cried the joyous guests in chorus. "A hostess who despises us to that extent must be called to order. Come on, Monsieur M. Take some paper and a pen. Write her some stinging epigrams. We must teach this princess of Germany how to behave. French officers, victors, lying between dirty sheets and eating off a filthy tablecloth. It's infamous." Monsieur M. was the too faithful interpreter of the unanimous sentiments of these gentlemen. Heated as he was by the fumes of Hungarian wine, he wrote to the Princess de Liechtenstein such a letter as one would not dare to write to the lowest of public women, even in carnival time. How describe what Madame de Liechtenstein felt on reading this epistle, this assemblage of all that the language of the guardroom could furnish of what is vile? It required the testimony of a third person to make her believe that the signature M, Sergeant Major of the French Imperial Guard, had not been counterfeited by some miserable drunkard. In profound indignation, the princess hastened to the house of General Andreassi, governor of Vienna, for His Majesty. She showed him this letter and demanded vengeance. The general, still more irritated than she, got into a carriage and went to Schönbrunn, where he arrived during the parade. He handed the emperor the fatal epistle. The emperor read it. He drew back a step or two, his cheeks reddening with anger, his expression altered, and in a frightful voice he told the grand marshal to summon Monsieur M. Everybody trembled. "Is it you who wrote the letter?" "Sire." "Answer, I tell you. Is it you?" "Yes, sire," in a moment of forgetfulness after a supper. "Wretch!" shouted His Majesty, in a way fit to terrify all who heard it. "You deserve to be shot on the spot. To insult a woman in this cowardly way, and an old woman, too. Have you no mother? I respect and honor every old woman because she reminds me of my mother." "Sire, I am culpable, I confess it, but my repentance is great. Deign to think of my services. I have made 18 campaigns. I am the father of family." This last remark increased His Majesty's anger. "Arrest him! Tear off his decoration. He is unworthy to wear it. Let him be tried within 24 hours. Then turning to the generals, silent with stupefaction. "See here, gentlemen, read this. See how this blackguard treats a princess at the very moment when her husband is negotiating a peace with me." The parade went fast that day. When it was over, General Dorset and Mr. Larry ran to the house of Madame de Liechtenstein. They described to her the scene that had just occurred and made the most affecting excuses to her in the name of the Imperial Guard. They implored her to intercede for an unhappy wretch, very guilty doubtless, but who was not in his right mind when he wrote. He repents, madame, said the good Monsieur Larry. He laments his fault. He awaits his punishment with courage, and as a just reparation for his outrage against you. But he is one of the best officers in the army. He is esteemed and cherished. He has saved the lives of thousands of persons, and his distinguished talents are the only fortune of his family. What will become of them if he has to die? To die, said the princess, to die. Good God, are things to go as far as that? General d'Orsay went on to describe to her the resentment of the emperor as 1,000,000 times keener than his own. And the princess, deeply affected, wrote a letter to the emperor in which, professing herself satisfied and grateful for the reparation she had obtained, she entreated him to pardon Monsieur M. His Majesty read this letter and did not answer it. Again, they visited the princess, who this time became extremely alarmed and said that she was truly distressed at having shown Monsieur M.'s letter to the general. Determined to do all in her power to obtain the surgeon's pardon, she addressed a petition to the emperor, which he terminated by this phrase of truly angelic kindness. Sire, I'm going to kneel in my oratory, and I will not rise until I have obtained from heaven your majesty's clemency. The emperor could no longer refuse. He pardoned. Monsieur M was let off with a month of close arrest. Monsieur Larry was commissioned by his majesty to scold him roundly, so that he shall take better care thenceforward of the honor of the respectable body of which he formed part. The remonstrances of this excellent man were quite fatherly, and doubled in the eyes of Monsieur M the value of the service he had rendered him. Monsieur the Baron Larry did good disinterestedly. People knew this and often abused it. General D.A., the son of a wealthy senator, had his shoulder fractured by a bullet at the Battle of Wagram. An amputation was necessary. This alarming operation demanded a practiced hand Monsieur Larry alone could undertake. And he did so, and successfully, but the wounded man, who was naturally delicate and now extremely enfeebled, required the greatest care and most intermitted attention. Monsieur Larry seldom left him. He also placed near him 2 of his pupils, who watched alternately and aided him in dressing the wound. The treatment was long and painful, but it ended in a perfect cure. When fully convalescent, the general took leave of the emperor to return to France. The majorat and some decorations paid the debt owed him by the sovereign and the state. The manner in which he discharged his own to the man who saved his life is curious to know. Just as he was about entering his carriage, he handed to a general of his acquaintance a letter and a little box, saying, I cannot leave Vienna without thanking Monsieur Larry. Do me the kindness to send him from me this token of my gratitude. That good Larry, I shall never forget the services he has rendered me. The next day, the friend acquitted himself of his commission. A gendarme was charged with the epistle and the present. He arrived at Schönbrunn during the parade and inquired throughout the ranks for Monsieur Larry. Here is a letter in a box I brought from General D.A. Monsieur Larry put them both into his pocket, but after the parade he examined their contents, and remitting the packet to Monsieur Cadet de Gaussincourt, he said to him, Look at this and tell me what you think of it. The letter was very pretty. As to the box, it enclosed a diamond worth about 60 francs. This mean recompense recalls a glorious and worthy one, which Monsieur Larry had received from the emperor during the Egyptian campaign. At the Battle of Aboukir, General Fouquier was operated on by Monsieur Larry under the enemy's fire for a dangerous wound in the shoulder, and believing himself at the point of death, he offered his sword to General Bonaparte, saying, General, someday you will perhaps envy my fate. The general-in-chief presented this sword to Monsieur Larry after having his name and that of the battle engraved upon it. However, General Fouquier did not die. He was saved by the skillful operation he had undergone, and for 17 years he commanded the disabled soldiers at Avignon. Chapter 8. It is impossible to seize certain differences in the manners and tone of military men while they are in the face of the enemy. The exigencies of the service absorb all the time and thoughts of the officers. whatever their grade. And the uniformity of their occupations produces also a sort of uniformity in their habits and characters. But away from the battlefield, their dissimilarities of nature and education reappear. I had experienced this many times during the truces and treaties of peace, which crowned the emperor's most glorious campaigns, and I had occasion to renew my observations on this head during our long stay at Schönbrunn with the army. The military tone is one of the things most difficult to define in the army. This tone differs according to the grades, the time of service, and the kind of service. In reality, there are no military men but those who belong to the line or who command it. In the opinion of the soldiers, Prince de Neuchâtel and his brilliant staff, the Grand Marshal, Generals Bertrand, Bachelor d'Alba, etc., were merely cabinet officials, whose attainments might make them good for something, but to whom bravery was not indispensable. The principal generals, such as Prince Eugène, Marshals Oudinot, Davout, Bessières, and His Majesty's aides-de-camp, Rapp, Lebrun, Lauriston, Mouton, etc., were thoroughly urbane. Their dignity never approached arrogance, nor their ease and excessive familiarity. Their manners always bore the impress of a wholly soldier-like severity. The army had not the same idea of several of the orderly officers and aides-de-camp. Even while, according to them, the consideration merited by their education and courage, they were called the army jays, obtaining favors better deserved by others, getting ribbons and majorats for bearing dispatches in camp without ever seeing the enemy, insulting by their luxury the modest uniform of the bravest officers, occupied incessantly with their toilette, and still more foppish in the midst of battalions than in the boudoirs of their mistresses. There was one of these gentlemen whose silver gilt cartridge box was a complete little dressing case containing, instead of cartridges, perfume bottles, brushes, a mirror, a tongue scraper, a shell comb, and I am not sure that there was not even a pot of rouge. It was not that they were not brave. They would have let themselves be killed for a look, but they seldom found themselves exposed. Foreigners would have reason to lay it down as an axiom that the French military man is light, presumptuous, impertinent, and immoral. If they appreciated him by the standard of these officers by favor who, instead of study and service, had sometimes no other right to their grades than the merit of having emigrated. The officers of the line, who had made several campaigns and gained their epaulettes on battlefields, seemed very different to the army, grave, polite, and obliging. There was a sort of fraternity between them, having had a near view of poverty and sufferings. They were always ready to succor others. Their conversation was not remarkable for brilliant information, but it was often full of interest. Generally, the habit of boasting quitted them along with their earliest youth, and the bravest were always the most modest. The false point of honor had no great ascendancy over them because they knew their own worth, and the fear of being supposed cowardly was beneath them. For them, who sometimes united the greatest kindliness to a vivacity not less great, a contradiction or even an insult uttered by a brother in arms did not absolutely need to be washed out in blood, and examples in this moderation, which true courage alone is entitled to display, were not rare in the army. The most generous and those who cared least for money were those who were the most exposed. The artillerymen, the hussars. At Wagram, I saw Lieutenant pay a louis a bottle for brandy and distribute it on the spot to the soldiers of his company. These brave officers were sometimes so attached to their regiments, especially if they were distinguished, that they would refuse promotion rather than be separated from their children, as they called them. It is here that the type of French military men should be looked for. It is this kindliness, blended with soldierly firmness, this attachment of captains for their soldiers, an attachment which the latter know so well to appreciate. It is this unshaken honor which should distinguish our soldiers, and not, as foreigners believe, the presumption, the braggadocio, the libertinage, which belong only to certain parasites of glory. At Camp Lobau, the day before the Battle of Wagram, the emperor was walking around his tent. He stopped for a moment to look at the grenadiers of the guard who were breakfasting. "Well, my children, how do you like the wine?" "It will make us drunk, sire." There is our cellar, said a soldier, pointing to the Danube. The emperor, who had ordered a good bottle of wine for each soldier, was surprised to find them dieted on the eve of a battle. He asked the reason. From Prince de Neuchâtel, inquiries were made, and it was learned that 2 storekeepers and a victualling clerk had sold for their own benefit 40,000 bottles intended for the distribution, and that they intended to replace it by inferior wine. It was valued at 30,000 florins and had been seized by the imperial guard in a rich abbey. The guilty persons were arrested, tried, and condemned to death. At the camp of Lobau, there was a dog which all the army, I think, knew under the name of Cortegar. He was old, dirty, and ugly, but his moral qualities soon obliterated all memory of his external defects. Hence, he was sometimes called the bravest dog of the empire. He had received a bayonet thrust at Marengo. He had a paw broken by a shot at Austerlitz. He was then attached to a regiment of dragoons, for he had no master. He would attach himself to a corps and remain faithful to it so long as he was fed and not beaten. A kick or a blow with the flat of a saber would make him desert the regiment and pass to another. He had a rare intelligence. Whatever might be the position of the corps in which he served, he would not abandon it and never confounded it with the others. In the hottest of the fray, he was always close to the flag he had selected. If in camp he met a soldier of the regiment he had deserted, you would meet him, drop his ears, put his tail between his legs, and slink away as fast as possible to his new brethren in arms. When his regiment was marching, he scampered everywhere on scout duty, warning them by his barking of all that he found extraordinary. More than once, he saved his comrades from the ambuscade. Among the officers who perished at the Battle of Wagram, or rather in a particular engagement which took place when the battle was over, General Ude was one of those who were most regretted by the soldiers. He was one of the most intrepid generals of the army, but what brings his name especially to my memory, rather than that of any other lost by the army on that memorable day, is a note I have preserved of a conversation I had some years after the battle with an excellent officer to whom I was united by the most sincere friendship. In an interview which I had with Lieutenant Colonel B in 1812, he said to me, "I must tell you, my dear Constant, the curious adventure that happened to me at Wagram. I did not tell you at the time because I had promised to keep silence, but now that no one can be compromised any longer by my indiscretion, and that even those who would have dreaded most their singular ideas, for I never called them otherwise, should be revealed, would be the first to laugh at them. I may very well acquaint you with the mysterious discovery I made at this period. You know that I was in very close intimacy with poor F, for whom we have so greatly regretted. He was one of the gayest and most amiable of our young officers, and his good qualities made him dear, especially to those who had, like him, a constant propensity to frankness and good humor. Suddenly, I found his manners changing as well as those of some of his habitual companions. They appeared somber, no longer assembled for cheerful pleasantries, but, on the contrary, were always mysteriously whispering together. The sudden change had struck me on several occasions. I had chanced to meet them frequently in out-of-the-way places, and instead of greeting me cordially as they had been accustomed to do, they seemed desirous to avoid me. At last, tired of this mystery, which I could not understand, I one day took F aside and asked what this stranger's conduct signified. "You have forestalled me, my dear fellow," said he. "I was about to make you an important communication. I don't want you to accuse me of a lack of confidence, but swear to me before I confide in you that you will not tell a living soul one word of what I am about to say." When I had taken this oath, which he demanded in a tone very serious, and to me most surprising, F answered, "If I have never spoken to you about the Philadelphians, it is because I knew that reasons which I respect would prevent Jan from joining them. But since you asked me for this secret, it would be a lack of confidence and perhaps an imprudence not to reveal to you. Several patriots have united under the title of Philadelphians to save the country from the dangers to which it is exposed. The Emperor Napoleon has tarnished the glory of First Consul Bonaparte. He has saved our liberty, and he has torn it from us by the reestablishment of the nobles and the Concordat. The Society of Philadelphians has not as yet any settled means for preventing the evil which ambition would continue to do to France. It is when peace shall be restored to us that we shall see whether it is henceforward impossible to bring back Bonaparte to republican institutions. Meanwhile, we are overwhelmed with sorrow and despair. The brave chieftain of the Philadelphians, the virtuous Ude, has been assassinated. Who will be worthy to replace him? Poor Ude. Never was anyone more audacious, more eloquent than he. To a noble loftiness of character and unshaken firmness, he joined an excellent heart. His first battle showed all the energy of his soul. Knocked down at San Bartolomeo by a shot, his comrades wished to raise him. No, no, he cried, don't busy yourselves with me. At the Spaniards, at the Spaniards! Shall we leave you to the enemy? Said one of those who had approached him. Well, repulse them then, if you don't want them to have me. At the opening of the Wagram campaign, he was colonel of the 9th Regiment of the Line. He was made general of the brigade on the eve of battle. His corps formed part of the left wing, commanded by Massena. It was on this side that our line was broken. For a moment, Ude made incredible efforts to reform it. Struck 3 times by a lance, losing quantities of blood, dragged along by those of ours who were forced to recoil, he had himself tied to his horse so as not to leave the combat. After the battle, he was ordered to go forward and place himself and his regiment in an advantageous post for observation and to return at once to headquarters with a certain number of his officers to receive new orders. He executed this movement and returned during the night. All of a sudden, a discharge of musketry was heard. He fell into an ambush. He combated furiously in the darkness without knowing either the number or the nature of his adversaries. At break of day, he was found stretched out, riddled with wounds. In the midst of 20 officers massacred around him, he was breathing still. He lived 3 days, and the only words he could utter were to mourn the fate of his country. When his body was taken from the hospital to receive the last honors, several wounded men tore off their bandages in despair. A sergeant major threw himself upon his sword beside his grave, and a lieutenant blew out his brains. This, added F., is what plunges us into the most profound affliction. I tried to prove to him that he was mistaken and demonstrate that the schemes of the Philadelphians were follies, but I did not altogether succeed, and even while listening to my advice, he strongly recommended me to secrecy. I think it was the day after the Battle of Wagram that a rather large number of the officers came to breakfast near the Emperor's tent. The generals sat on the grass, and the officers stood around them. There was a great deal of talk about the battle, and several very remarkable incidents were related, which have remained graven in my memory. An orderly officer said to His Majesty, I thought I had lost my finest horse, as I had ridden him on the 5th. She wanted him to rest. I gave him to my servant to rein him in. He left him for a moment to rebridle his own. The horse was stolen in a moment between him and me by a dragoon who, without delay, went and sold him to a dismounted captain, saying that it was one of the horses taken. I recognized it in the ranks and reclaimed it, proving by my portmanteau and my effects, which were upon it, that it had not been taken from the Austrians. I reimbursed the captain for the 20 louis he had given the dragoon for his horse, which had cost me 60. Perhaps the finest incident of the day was this. Mr. Salsdorf, a Saxon surgeon of Prince Christian's regiment, had his leg fractured by a shell in the first part of battle. Extended on the guard, he saw Monsieur Amédée de Courberg in aide de camp, who, grazed by a ball, fell and began to vomit blood. He saw that this officer would die of apoplexy if he were not assisted. Collecting his forces, he crept and crawled through the dust until he reached him, bled him, and saved his life. Monsieur de Courberg could not embrace his preserver. Mr. Salsdorf transported to Vienna, lived only 4 days after his amputation. Chapter 9. At Schönbrunn, as elsewhere, His Majesty signalized his presence by his good deeds. One trait which people long talked of at this period has remained impressed on my memory. A little girl of 9 years belonging to a rich and much respected family in Constantinople was carried off by pirates one day as she was walking outside the city with a maidservant. The pirates transported their 2 captives to Anatolia and sold them. The little girl, who promised to be charming one day, fell into the hands of a rich merchant of Brusa, the most severe, rigid, and intractable man in the city. Nevertheless, the artless graces of the child affected his savage temper. He had the greatest respect for him, made a distinction between her and his other slaves, and employed her in none but easy tasks such as caring for flowers, etc. A European who was lodging with him offered to take charge of her education, and her owner consented to all the more willingly because she had gained his heart and he wished to marry her as soon as she should be old enough. But the European had conceived the same idea, and he was young, good-looking, full of intelligence, and very rich. He easily succeeded in winning the young slave, who escaped one fine day from her master's house and, like a new Eloise, followed her Abelard to Cutea, where they remained in hiding for 6 months. She was then 10 years old. Her preceptor, who daily loved her better, took her to Constantinople and confided her to the care of a Greek bishop, whom he instructed to make a good Christian of her. From there he started for Vienna to seek the consent of his family and his government to make her his wife. 2 years slipped by. The poor girl received no tidings of her future husband. The bishop was dead, and his heirs had abandoned Marie, the baptismal name of the converted Mohammedan, and she, having neither aid nor protector, was in constant danger of being discovered by some relative, some friend of her family, and it is known that the Turks never pardon a change of religion. Tormented by 1,000 anxieties, tired of the profound obscurity of her retreat, she took the bold resolution of rejoining her benefactor. The dangers of the journey did not deter her. She left Constantinople alone and on foot. And on arriving at the Austrian capital, she learned that her husband had been dead more than a year. It is easy to understand the despair into which the poor child must now have been plunged. What could she do? What would become of her? She determined to return to her family. She went to Trieste and found that city in a frightful condition. It had just received a French garrison, but the troubles inseparable from war were not yet over. Little Marie entered a Greek convent to await a favorable moment for returning to Constantinople. There she was seen by a young sub-lieutenant of infantry called d'Artois, who fell violently in love with her and married her at the end of the year. The happiness enjoyed by Madame d'Artois did not persuade her to relinquish her scheme of going to see her family. Having become a Frenchwoman, she hoped that this title would induce her relative to pardon her. Her husband's regiment having been ordered away from Trieste, she seized this occasion to renew her entreaties for his permission to go to Constantinople. He consented, but not without laying before her all the dangers and risks to which this journey would expose her. At last she set out, and on a few days after her arrival, when she was about to make her advances to her family, she recognized in the street, through her veil, the merchant of Brusa, her first master, who was searching for her all over Constantinople and who had sworn to kill her should he discover her.